Welcome to Better Health Guy Blogcasts, empowering your better health. And now, here's Scott, your Better Health Guy. The content of this show is for informational purposes only and is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any illness or medical condition. Nothing in today's discussion is meant to serve as medical advice or as information to facilitate self-treatment. As always, please discuss any potential health-related decisions with your own personal medical authority.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode number 30 of the Better Health Guy blogcast series. Today's guest is Dr. Amy Derksen, and the topic of the show is Approaches to Autism. Dr. Amy Derksen is a Naturopathic and DAN physician, fellow Medical Academy of Pediatric Special Needs, and board certified in Integrative Pediatrics. She did her undergraduate studies in Biochemistry, which she applies to the understanding of the newest research on detoxification and genetic susceptibilities. She graduated from Bastyr University with a full scope of practice in Washington State since 2003. She was fortunate to do her medical postgraduate training with Dr. Dietrich Klinghardt. Dr. Klinghardt has developed an amazing system of advanced kinesiology called ART, or Autonomic Response Testing, which helps determine stressors to the autonomic nervous system. She's an instructor for ART for the Klinghardt Academy. Dr. Derksen specializes in working both with autism and chronically ill patients, including Lyme disease. She feels that the more we can understand about our kids, the more we will understand about everyone's health. The autistic child is very similar to a toxic adult. They've just accumulated those toxins in a much shorter period of time. I met Dr. Amy Derksen almost 12 years ago, and she's been a mentor of mine ever since. And now my interview with Dr. Amy Derksen. Hello, Dr. Derksen. I am excited to have you on the show today talking about such an important topic. I know how passionate you are about working with children, both with autism and also children that may have something like Lyme disease but may not be on the autism spectrum. I'm very excited today to learn from your experience and have you share your knowledge with our listeners. So thank you for taking the time out of your very busy schedule to be here today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited.
I'm excited as well. So how did you start working with children on the autism spectrum?
It was kind of by accident a little bit. So I was working with Dr. Klinghardt, so Dietrich Klinghardt, who is an MD, PhD. And, that was my first experience right out of school. He was working a lot with adults with chronic illness. And we had a few kids that entered our practice who were on the spectrum, one with Rett syndrome, one with kind of classic autism that we think at this point is now mold-induced for that child. But parents were very influential and kind of took me under their wing. I was kind of a brand new doctor, and it was exciting for me. The kids responded so quickly or flared so quickly to some of the treatments that we were doing for our adults. And, it was at a time that B12 and folinic acid and DMPS, that these were breakthroughs for working with kids. And then we also worked with a child with seizures, and they responded so well, seizures that had actually come on right after some vaccinations. And the responses were so fast and so amazing. I got so excited and I couldn't help but fall in love with working with it.
I know. I definitely know you're passionate about it and love working with the kids, and it's amazing for them to have the opportunity to work with you as well. I mentioned in the introduction that you feel that the more we understand about our kids, the more we can understand about everyone's health. And I personally have been drawn to learn about autism as well, because it seems like there's so many issues that are similar between a child on the spectrum and an adult with chronic Lyme or other chronic illnesses. And so I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about how understanding kids on the spectrum helps us to approach recovering health for everyone with chronic illness.
Absolutely. I think our kids are our canaries, right? So they're the ones that are showing the signs that our food sources are more toxic, that our environment is changing. I mean, you see these autism rates skyrocketing, and it's not just about diagnosing them earlier or over-diagnosing them. It is our kids are getting more sick. We're seeing more food allergies. We're seeing more immune dysregulation. We're seeing low immunoglobulins. I mean, we're seeing all of this stuff. The thing that's been so helpful for me working with kids is they're such fast responders. I think, for one, they're not emotionally attached to their illness like some adults can be over time, or attached to the thought that they'll always be sick. So they can respond really quickly. But, kids they regenerate so quickly. So either if they're going to flare from something, they flare. But if they respond, they go from not talking to talking from one visit to the next, and it can be amazing. So I learn a lot from the kids of what's helping them, what's harming them, what are the stressors that are changing over the years working with them, and then I apply that to my adults as well.
Fantastic. So can you talk to us a little bit about the connection between Lyme disease and autism? And is there a strong connection? And then when Lyme is present, is it causal, or is it just one of many issues that may lead to the bucket overflowing, essentially?
Oh my gosh, that's probably one of the big questions. It depends who you talk to. For a long time, and I know there's still doctors who feel like you can't treat autism if you're not doing antibiotics for Lyme disease. But the longer I've been working with this, the more I'm seeing that Lyme is just one piece that's overflowing our bucket of toxicity. And Lyme and the co-infections are very inflammatory. Ty Vincent talks about this a lot when he's talking about LDI, but we've been seeing this. You deal with this, you get these very strange inflammatory reactions that are happening in the body, and the immune system is just dysregulated. And if you look at adults with Lyme disease, if you run lab tests on a partner who's sick and their healthy partner, their labs may look the same. They both may have positive IgG and even a positive IgM, but one has a healthy immune response to it and the other doesn't. And, I think with autism, we have a dysregulated immune system. We respond poorly to Lyme, but also to all these viruses. If you run titers, you have these crazy high viral titers. You have all these weird responses to gut bacteria. It's just one more piece. And I think if we only focus on the Lyme, we're missing the big picture.
I would agree. That's fantastic. So what are some of the common denominators that you see in children with autism? What are the things that come up most frequently that you need to address?
So we know there's methylation needs. So they probably need B12 shots, but they probably also need some support with either methylfolate or folinic acid. They clearly are going to be low in minerals, especially zinc and especially magnesium. So, and if you look at, if you have any understanding of the methylation pathways, if you look, those are nutrients that each gene or each step of the methylation cycle is dependent on, B6, B2, zinc, magnesium, all of these things are so important. And then we look at the gut, it goes back to basic naturopathic principles. The gut is a mess. If you run a stool test on these kids or an OAT test on these kids, their guts are a mess. And that lack of diversity in the microbiome, this weird, abnormal, like we have no growth of our good probiotics. So no Acidophilus, no Bifidus, but crazy gobs of every other bacteria you can imagine. That is all contributing to abnormal neurotransmitter production and just a dysregulated system.
So for those people listening, the OAT test is a urine organic acids, and that's one of the tests, as I understand, that you find to be very helpful in giving you some insights as to what's happening with a child or an adult.
Yeah. So probably my two favorite tests when it comes to kids is going to be a comprehensive digestive stool analysis. So a full stool test through one of the specialty labs, and then a urine organic acid test. Absolutely.
Perfect. How significant is toxicity in children on the spectrum? And then what are some of the tools that you use to support detoxification? You've mentioned methylation, but are there some favorite toxin binders or drainage support, organ support things that you recommend for kids on the spectrum?
So I think there's two things, addressing toxicity and addressing microbes. And I think, a lot of kids that come to my practice, so I'm not a first stop. I used to be, I'm not anymore. So I'm kind of a last stop. So a lot of times people have jumped ahead and they're treating the bugs and they're treating all these other things, or they're doing chelation, but they miss the fact that, these kids aren't excreting well, which is why we see these crazy high chemical loads or metal loads and all these things for very limited exposures. And so we have to think about supporting the detox pathways, kidneys, liver, what comes out through the skin, and how they're pooping. So that sort of basic support. So toxin binders are really helpful because our liver, if it's functioning right, will be secreting a lot of toxins in the bile, and we want to make sure it doesn't reabsorb and that it actually gets carried out in the stool. So I really like a zeolite extract, like BioPure's Zeobind is great. It doesn't taste like much of anything. Bentonite can be helpful. Charcoal is one of my favorites, especially if there's ammonia issues or a lot of yeast die-off that makes acetaldehyde. The charcoal can be really helpful for that. Butyrate, also one of my favorites, which also supports like healthy gut flora, binds up ammonia, which is contributing to some of that brain fog. So binder-wise is good. I also find that homeopathic drainage remedies can be fantastic, whether it's someone who really knows UNDA numbers or it's traditional homeopathy, or like some of the Bacana remedies are fantastic that you can just do for general drainage of liver, kidneys, and the lymph system. Getting kids moving, making sure they're getting exercise. I think sometimes we focus too much on some of these therapies and going to school and going to this class, and that we forget that our kids need to be out and moving around. So, letting your kids jump like a little trampoline is fantastic. Just getting out and playing and climbing and moving is good. Making sure we're well hydrated. And then there's a ton of herbs and things you can do. Milk thistle is great. You can get it as a non-alcohol tincture, like as a glycerite, and it really supports glutathione production, but really helps the liver.
Yeah, I remember working with you a bit about 10 years ago, where I found one of my favorite liver support things, which was the Liver Life, that I still use today. Actually, yeah, it's
such a good one. So Liver Life, and then Nutrimedic's Berber, both so good. They're unique little remedies, but something that people keep going back to because it makes them feel better.
And I saw this week that our friend Chris Shade over at Quicksilver Scientific has a new binder coming out in July. I think it's called the Ultimate Binder or something like that. But it's a combination of lots of these different things that you just mentioned. And so I'm excited to try that as well.
Yeah, the combination products are good. And there have been some over the years that I've really liked. And then all of a sudden they can't get one of the ingredients and the product goes away. So yeah, Chris Shade has some great products. He makes the intestinal metal detox, or IMD powder, which is really good, especially if we know we're excreting some heavy metals.
Yeah, and I saw that's one of the ingredients of his new binder product as well. So I'm
excited.
Oh, nice. I'm always looking for better tools. It's great.
Good. I got to keep talking to you. You always send me stuff. I can't keep up.
You definitely can keep up. I've learned a tremendous amount from you over the years. So what types of microbial issues do you find most common in children with autism? And then how do you approach supporting them against these microbial overgrowths?
Yeah, so it's like, what do they not deal with? But you have to start with the gut. So we look at the gut, there's a lot of yeast issues. So if your kid is silly, stimmy, the red cheeks, the red ears, the tiptoe walking, the fingers that do this, that's yeast. Or do they get kind of drunk when they eat sugar, or are they always, sneaking into carbs and sugar? Because that, kids tend to do that, but kids on the spectrum don't always tend to do that. And so that one will tend to come and go. And so yeast is a huge, huge issue. And then the bacterial dysbiosis is huge. We see a ton of Clostridia, which is very opportunistic and typically something in a healthy adult you don't see unless there've been a lot of antibiotic use, but we're seeing it in kids who've never done antibiotics before. With the bacteria, I tend to see a lot more aggression. So if you see the biting, the hitting, the drooling, the chewing, everything, that's bacteria. And then the other thing we also deal with a lot of is parasites. So which tends to trigger a lot of eosinophils and histamine and allergy sort of symptoms, but also aggression. And it's a little more cyclical than the bacteria. So come monthly or maybe twice a month, often around the moon cycles. As hocus pocus as that seems, it's really when they become more active. And you'll start to see this. I see a lot of insomnia that goes with that, but really aggression is kind of the thing that goes there. So it all comes back to the gut.
So when parasites are present, how do you approach helping the body to eliminate them?
I wish I could be a good naturopath and say that I can do it naturally, but this is one where I really jump to prescriptions. So often I do a parade of antiparasitics. I muscle test for a living. So I help to kind of cut through what does this child need at this point. So I test all the remedies to see what they need. But very often we're needing 3 to 5 different antiparasitics in a row. So a true parasite protocol may be 2 to 3 months long with things in succession. And you're really just watching which thing made the biggest impact on them. And that's maybe something that we have to pulse for a few extra months.
Another thing that we hear in the world of autism is Clostridia. And so what role does Clostridia play in autism?
So Clostridia is huge, and it's really tough to eradicate. But the Clostridia you've got to think of when you're seeing aggression and biting. It makes a lot of quinolinic acid, which is very inflammatory in the brain. And so which is why we see sometimes like your kids are pushing against you with all their might to push on their heads, or they're burying their head into the couch. That's often a Clostridia sign. And sometimes I've seen kids that have actually been referred to a psychiatrist for rage and have even been threatened to be put in a home. And it really is just a gut bacterial issue. And as soon as you treat it, sometimes within a day, they're back to this calm, sweet kid. And you can often see, with your child, you'll see it coming. It's like it brews out of nowhere. And sometimes kids will say, oh no, here it comes. And they'll feel it coming over like an hour or so, where it's almost like this personality takes over and they start to look like a wild animal. It's scary. So the Clostridia you can easily identify on an organic acid test. The downfall of that is it takes a few weeks to get those results back. You can do a stool test just with the standard lab to look for that as well. typically treatments for that are either going to be Flagyl, which is metronidazole, or vancomycin, which is a little better tolerated. And Dr. Shaw over at Great Plains Labs was really showing for long-term resolution is we do a full 10-day protocol. So 3 times a day, 10 days. And then you do every third day for another 30 days. So essentially another 10-day protocol, but then spread out. So 2 days off, 1 day on for another 30 days. And they're getting much longer resolution so that it's not coming back. Natural things that have been helpful, probiotics like Culturelle and VSL3. Those seem to be really good, and high doses Saccharomyces can be helpful. So if you want, if you suspect that this is there, you don't have the money to do lab testing, you don't have a doctor willing to prescribe, jump to those probiotics and see how that goes. Sometimes kids are sensitive to probiotics. So if you see a worsening of behaviors, move along, stop that and try something else. Biocidin can be helpful, which is a natural remedy. I like that. It's a good all-purpose. Sometimes colloidal silver can be helpful. I haven't found it to be enough to eradicate the Clostridia. Sometimes prescription tinidazole can be helpful, especially if there's some overlap with other infections.
Perfect.
Yeah.
So you mentioned Ty Vincent, and we hear more and more in the Lyme arena about the importance of immune modulation and creating immune tolerance to these different toxins and to microbes. Low-dose immunotherapy, or LDIs, emerged over the past few years and seems to have a lot of promise in creating that immune tolerance and thus reducing inflammation. And so I'm wondering, how much of a role does immune modulation play in autism, and does low-dose immunotherapy work well for some of the kids?
Yeah, so, I think the immune piece, this Th1, Th2 imbalance is huge, which is why we've used transfer factors for a long time. And, so LDA, which is the more traditional treating foods, treating environmental inhalants, treating chemicals, that has been phenomenal. And I'm seeing better results even with the kids than I am with some of my adults. And so it's helping to reduce the overall, I think, inflammatory burden. I've seen some really amazing things on the LDI front when we go after the strep, especially with some of our pandas kids or kids that just get these weird behaviors when they're around strep. That has really, like, in the middle of a crisis, brings it right down, like almost immediately. Treating parasites with the LDI has been really helpful. I've had kind of a mixed bag treating Lyme. The Lyme mix that they have is 74 different organisms and really hard to find the right dose. Really unpredictable with the responses. So I'm still on the fence about that one, but the parasite one is good. I do a lot of custom stool LDI where we actually take a stool sample before we treat the child and dilute that down and then make basically remedies from that you mix with the enzyme and dose that way. And that's been phenomenal. I really see a calming of behaviors. If you get it right, you can flare things if you go too strong, for sure. So it's definitely hitting on something.
Yeah, no, that
and I know with
sense.
myself, it's been amazing. Like for the mold piece, the inhalants have been amazing for me.
Fantastic. So you mentioned pandas and PANS, and that's essentially an autoimmune type reaction to either strep or to other triggers, other infections, other environmental toxins, and so on. And so I'm wondering, are most kids that have pandas or PANS, are they also on the autism spectrum? What are some of the key issues with that condition, and then some of the tools that you use for approaching pandas and PANS?
That's a big question. Wow. So, a lot of times the PANS pandas will present like autism. Is it true autism? Hard to know. I have some kids where there clearly is the overlap. They're autistic and they have this PANS pandas piece. I would say in the middle of a flare, you look autistic, or you can just look, it can look like you have Tourette's, or it can look like you have uncontrollable rage and you're getting in trouble at school and you're punching holes in the wall and doing some of these things. The common thing is the child doesn't feel in control of that. So it feels like something's taking over them and they're very apologetic after these episodes. It's tough. You tend to see these low immunoglobulins in these kids when you're doing a quantitative immunoglobulin test. Not always, but you'll also see these abnormal titers sometimes, unless their immunoglobulins are so low. So sometimes we see these elevated strep titers. Sometimes we don't. The PANS is the bigger piece where it maybe isn't strep, it's something else. And so maybe it's a viral trigger. Possibly it's a chemical trigger. Lyme can be a trigger. Mycoplasma is common. There's a lot of things. And that's, I think, where it gets confusing on what is this diagnosis really, and does this exist, or what's the bigger thing that's going on? But really what we see is it's an abnormal immune response that results in odd behaviors, psychiatric behaviors as a response to the bugs. They do not get a fever. They're not getting a sore throat. they are having these weird motor tics and all like very odd symptoms.
Yeah, and it is certainly, you mentioned it's a big question, and I agree. So next week on Better Health Guy blogcast, we're having Amy Joy Smith, who's going to do an entire podcast on this topic. And so it's certainly one I like to learn more about it, because I find it frustrating that it's still a condition that most people don't accept, and children struggling with it either don't get a diagnosis or they still get invalidated, much like what happened with Lyme disease, several years ago, and to a smaller extent still happens today. So there was a fantastic documentary on this topic that's come out recently, and I think people should watch it because it's really compelling.
Yeah, for anyone that doesn't believe it exists, I have a few family homes that you can go visit and spend a day there, and you'll see. Yeah. You will see what the reality of what they're dealing with.
Yeah, it's a tough thing. So
the LDI has been helpful for that, I've got to say. In the resistant, if you are working with kids and the antibiotics or the antivirals and those things haven't brought those titers down and they're not resolving the kind of episodes, either high dose homeopathy, like the 1M or the 10M potencies, or the LDI has been very, very helpful. I've seen in some of these resistant kids, the titers are finally coming down.
Yeah, and of all the stories that I've heard about LDI as well, I would say the pandas kids, parents of the pandas kids are the ones where I've heard most consistently, like our whole journey just completely shifted for the positive. Yeah. So what is the role of inflammation in autism? And then what are some of the tools that you can use to help kind of reduce this brain on fire, as some people may refer to it? How critical is inflammation?
Yeah, so inflammation, I think, is a major factor in autism and really in any chronic illness. We started to identify that really about 10 years ago, and it's just becoming more and more common talk at this point. So, anti-inflammatories are good. I really am a huge fan of curcumin, or especially the liposomal preparations of curcumin that can actually get into the nervous system. Boswellia can be helpful. And then treating the gut is helpful, because a lot of times I'm finding the source of the inflammation is actually coming from the gut. So figuring out what's triggering the fire in the first place. Is it a parasite? Is it a weird bacteria? Sometimes we need antimicrobials in conjunction with that. Sometimes antihistamines can also be really helpful to stop that kind of cytokine cascade that can be happening there. So I'm a huge fan of like ketotifen, which is a gut antihistamine that is compounded. That can sometimes stop that fire from starting in the first place. High dose fish oils are also really helpful, like 3,000 to 4,000 milligrams a day of omega-3s can really help, or high doses of phosphatidylcholine I've seen pretty helpful with that as well.
Great. We know that Dr. Klinghardt has talked about cryptopyrroluria being a factor in 80% or more of adults with Lyme disease. And so I'm wondering, do you find this is also a common issue in autism? And you mentioned zinc, but zinc, B6, and all the other cofactors in KPU, are those important to explore in your kids as well?
Yeah, I think it's something like as a starting point that you have to consider, is this person sitting in front of you, whether it's a child on the spectrum or a chronically ill adult, are they having an abnormally high amount of heavy metals or chemicals, or are they really sensitive to the environment, sensitive to those things? Very likely they're not excreting very well, and those methylation pathways aren't working, and it goes beyond just the B12 and the folate. And even when I've talked to Dr. Newbrander, who, kind of the father of B12, his foundational thing is you always start people on B6, zinc, magnesium. Well, this is treating a cryptopyrroluria issue, whether or not you identify it in the lab or not, because the cryptopyrroles break down really fast. And so sometimes it's hard to get that lab test. And, I've stopped lab testing as much because I see these deficiencies across the board. I see we can do a zinc tally test in the office. Often you're not tasting the zinc, and, zinc should taste really bitter if you have enough in your system. And I'll give it to an infant, and there's like no change in the appearance on their face. They don't taste it. And a lot of times you'll find mom is the same way. A lot of loss of magnesium is happening. I think a lot of that is just getting wasted in the urine. And so I think these things are foundational that everyone should be on some support for that. Yeah, but I'm finding the kids are needing crazy high doses. Some of my kind of trickiest kids, especially my kids that seem to deal with heavy metals more than anything else, are needing very high doses, sometimes 90 or 120 milligrams a day of zinc picolinate, which is just pretty crazy.
Wow. What is the role of oxalates in autism? And then beyond diet, if someone has elevated oxalates, how do you address the oxalate issue in the kids?
So The oxalates tend to cause pain. So we see urinary frequency. You may find that your child is wetting the bed and they're still 7, they're 8, they're 9 years old. They're pulling on themselves after urinating, or they're pushing on their eyes in these episodes of like, oh, this, because it's eye pain. Oxalates are crystals and they're sharp. I used to work in a lab doing urinalysis, and when you would see oxalate crystals, it almost looks like a shard of glass. And so think of that, if that's in the tissues or it's coming out in the urine, it hurts. And so, yeast tends to make a lot of oxalates, but there can also be a genetic issue with accumulating oxalates. And so if you have the high oxalates, you tend to be also more sensitive to salicylates. You're going to be sensitive to a lot of fruits and vegetables, seem to be the big thing. They seem to trigger bad behaviors or accidents in your kids. And so treating the yeast is often where I start. A urine organic acid test is going to give you a really good idea if there's an oxalate issue or not, because it will look at those markers for that and can give you a good idea. Is it actually coming from yeast, or is this more of a genetic issue? Vitamin K2 is really helpful to bring that down. And so is magnesium citrate. Seems to mop up the oxalates, and magnesium citrate also a really good one just to help a child poop. So kill 2 birds with 1 stone.
Yeah, that's great. So how important is the home environment, both in terms of electromagnetic field exposure, but also the potential for ongoing water damage, building, mold type exposures?
Oh my gosh.
Is that something that comes up commonly in the families?
Yeah. So the home environment is tricky. The EMF issue or EMF exposure is getting more and more. Kids are on these iPads, there's smart meters, there's everything else. I think it's just another stimulant. So especially if your child's not sleeping or they're always stimming, and you notice if you go camping or you leave and they're calming down, there's probably something in the home that's a big trigger for them. I think the mold issue is a bigger issue. And it's interesting at all of the Lyme conferences going on now, everybody is saying it's actually, if someone's not getting better, it's probably because of molds. I'm suspecting that in some of these families where a child has PANS or PANDAS, things aren't responding, but you'll look and there's multiple kids in the family that are various degrees of sick, or have these very weird immune markers to different infections that just aren't budging. I'm really suspicious of molds, and don't assume because you live in a warm state or a warm, dry state that you don't have molds. And Arizona is actually one of the worst for molds. I grew up in Arizona and I can't even go back there without an asthma attack at this point. But I have a lot of families there, and they find that the discrepancy between the air conditioning inside and the heat outside actually sets you up for a lot of molds within the airspace there. And I'm seeing that. We're running labs on these homes, and it's horrible. So the mold is a trickier one, I think, because it sets off this inflammatory cascade. We'll see elevated MMP9 levels and TGF-beta1 levels, and I think it makes you much more reactive to everything else. And it's this sort of vague thing that comes on. It doesn't start. It's not like the second you go into that house, you get sick. It's the longer you're there, the more sick you become.
Yeah, and I don't know how much this has been explored, but I suspect that mold exposure also can affect some of the indicators on the Cunningham panel, which is used in pandas and pans, because I know when I was going through a significant mold exposure a couple years ago, my Cunningham panel was an issue, and strep had never been something that I really had brought up before in terms of my own health journey. So I suspect that also can trigger some of those things on the Cunningham panel as well.
I agree. Ask Amy Smith about it.
I will actually. It's a good one. I have seen some suggest, and I know you talk about this as well, that at the core of many of these health conditions are mitochondrial issues, not necessarily mitochondrial disease, but maybe less than optimal mitochondrial function. And so what is it that makes our mitochondria not happy? And then what can we do to make them smile again?
Make them smile again. So mitochondria within every cell, it's basically the thing that makes ATP. So it's essentially the thing that makes the gas to run the car. ATP is needed to drive every process of our body. And so what we see with a lot of kids should not be tired. They should not have that lack of fatigue. They should not be poor growth curves, any of those things. So if you're seeing sort of this lack of energy in the system, this lack of stamina, I'm suspecting mitochondria. And the longer that you've been sick or dealing with infection, the more that gets worked. And another thing to think of is if you are giving B12 shots or you're doing a lot of methylation support, and rather than getting more energy, you're getting actually more tired or exhausted, that's a sign that you just don't have the mitochondria to run that cycle in the first place. So making the mitochondria happy. There's a lot of formulations out there that are nice combination products that can be good. Some of them transdermal, some of them pills. I'm actually a huge fan of just acetyl L-carnitine and CoQ10. I find that those, for me, have been the most consistent as long as you're dosing high enough. Like, the biggest thing with mitochondria is you have to dose high enough or it doesn't do anything, because every cell has mitochondria. We want to replenish the mitochondria in the nervous system, in the adrenals, the ones deeper in the system, not just the ones near the gut. So, for a child, I'm looking at least 1,500 milligrams of acetyl L-carnitine. Even for like a 3-year-old, that's what I'm looking for. CoQ10, I'm sometimes going as high as 400 milligrams a day, which seems really high, but like, it helps to put out a fire. It's a great antioxidant, but also really supports kind of those mitochondria. And the mitochondria are so vulnerable. There have been some great presentations at the conferences I've been at recently of any of these chronic illnesses, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, all of these things that the mitochondria were damaged 10, 20 years before. And because those membranes are so vulnerable. So I think, anyone who's dealing with an illness, whether it's a child with autism or an adult with, fibromyalgia, you should be looking at your mitochondria.
Yeah, I'm in the middle now of reading Dave Asprey's new book, Headstrong, which is all about mitochondria and all the biohacks for mitochondria and stuff. It's actually quite interesting. And even things like, VIP, he mentions in this book. And so it's pretty comprehensive and definitely learning some new things there. I remember that Dr. Klinghardt also has mentioned that things like aluminum or other heavy metals can negatively impact the mitochondria. And so it seems like toxicity is another big factor that can cause a problem.
Of course. Because think of all the aluminum exposure we have in our foods now. With all this GMO food and all the pesticides that are around us, we are being bombarded. And I'm really seeing huge changes in stool tests over the last 5 years, especially. But I'm seeing changes across the board where our immune system is being damaged. We know the mitochondria are being damaged. We're seeing huge oxidative stress markers when we're running specialty labs. It's getting out of control, and that's coming from the environment. So that's why I think a lot of times we go back to the gut. When you don't know what to do, go to the gut.
And I know that not everyone can exercise, but if I remember correctly from one of your previous talks, that exercise is one of the few things that actually can help us create new mitochondria, right?
Yeah, so it's one of the only things that actually increases our number of mitochondria is exercise. And I think, we don't see enough kids out playing anymore, and they should be. Just think when we were kids, I'm dating myself, but you'd be running around the neighborhood and, your mom would have to holler out the door to get you to come in for dinner. We don't see that much anymore. So kids need to move around and do that. I think if you're an adult who's also chronically ill, get yourself moving, even if it means that you're just walking out to the mailbox and back and then starting to kind of push it a little more every day, or you're getting up off the couch and doing a little stretching. We need to get that circulation going. It'll help the lymph, but it'll also support your mitochondria.
Absolutely. One of the things that I've seen over the years is that kids that are being treated for autism, they definitely seem to have improvement. But I know that one of the frustrating aspects of it is that some don't always get that speech to really start happening. So I'm wondering if you can give us some insights or pearls around, how do you approach speech development in the kids?
Oh my gosh, it's so tricky, right? Speech is a tough one. Probably my biggest wows with speech have come after B12 shots. High doses of creatine, which if you think of that, ultimately methylation cycle is trying to make creatine and phosphatidylcholine. So again, I think it kind of goes back to methylation and really pushing that. And I haven't seen that with the oral products. It's been such a tricky one. Those have been really the big ones that have gotten me speech. If you're not getting speech at this point, I feel like we're still missing something a little deeper. So the focus isn't microbes. It's not these things. It is either mitochondria or methylation. That there's just not enough energy in the system to do that. And then once we've done some repair, then we need to get our kids around other children, maybe younger children, of where they lost that development. So they need to have something that they're mimicking. I think that's the time where the OT, the speech therapy, the ABA therapies, I think that's where they come into play. I don't think those therapies should be first. I think you have to do some repair and get the body ready to actually respond to those things. And that's where those therapies can actually really shine.
Makes a lot of sense. You mentioned pooping earlier, and we know how critical that is for detoxification. So how do you get your kids pooping when they're not? And I know it's a common issue in both kids and adults.
Yeah, so magnesium citrate, like natural calm powder, is one of my favorites for sure. And it's just being consistent with that and finding the dose that works. And, if you do too much, your child's going to basically have cramps and diarrhea. So it's usually between 1 to 3 teaspoons every night. And you want it consistent. I want a bowel movement every day, if not more than one bowel movement a day. And then once you get on a regular cycle, like I have a lot of kids that have come that maybe poop once a week. That's horrifying to me. Like, how could you do antibiotics with a child who's pooping once a week? So, we have to get the bowels moving because that's how we excrete. We don't want to push anything else until that happens. Prunes can be helpful. Slippery elm. There's a tea combination that most grocery stores have called Smooth Move. That one can be nice and actually taste relatively pleasant. And so drinking a cup of that a day can be good. Making sure they're hydrated. Identifying some food allergens. So what's the diet like? Is there something there? Dairy is notorious for causing constipation. The other thing is yeast is notorious for triggering constipation. So if you haven't addressed yeast, you can do this naturally with like Saccharomyces or caprylic acid, or those are usually the best. Maybe use a little uva ursi or some biocidin. There's things you can safely get your hands on to see, does it start to shift things a little bit? Those are usually my favorites.
Very helpful. That's great.
Yeah.
What is the relative impact of microbial overgrowths as compared to toxicity in these kids? Is it that the microbes have come in because the body is toxic, or are they kind of more equally positioned? How do you kind of compare the microbes to the toxicity?
I don't know. Who knows what comes first, chicken or egg, right? Mm-hmm. I know the microbes are there. They're very opportunistic. So I think the environment was off. Somehow it set them up that the wrong things are growing. Then the wrong things grow and it kills off your good bacteria and it skyrockets from there. The body tries to maintain homeostasis. It does that by sort of mopping up anything it can. So a lot of these toxins, I think, that are in our food, did it trigger that in the first place, or is it being held onto by these bugs? Yeast and bacteria, they latch onto a lot of these heavy metals and the aluminum and some of these chemicals just to try and maintain some sort of normalcy there. And so, which is a lot of times why you see when you chelate someone, all of a sudden they get really yeasty, or you treat yeast and we see some really bad behaviors because they've released a lot of toxins. And so it's hard to know what came first, but you can't treat one without the other.
Right. Yeah, I totally agree. And then
once you're there, you've got them both.
And then unfortunately, these microbes internally are creating a lot of toxicity as well, right? I heard at one of the conferences that the majority of our toxicity is actually being produced internally. We think of all the external stuff, but there's probably more that's being produced in our bodies than what we're getting exposed to externally.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and all of these toxins that they secrete are so excitatory. And so they create gobs of dopamine, which we see these behavior. I mean, it would just like, why would a bacterial infection in the gut cause aggression to the point of like breaking your mother's arm? It's excitatory, it's causing chaos.
There's a lot of talk about mast cell activation syndrome over the past year and how mast cells overproduce histamine and also then are a significant piece of the inflammatory cycle. And so I'm wondering, does this also happen in children with autism? And if so, how do you approach stabilizing mast cells while you're also addressing the underlying triggers?
Yeah, so I think we have to figure out what is the fire. So we know there's like some inflammation or something, but how did we get there in the first place? And so, kind of how I approach this, I look at binders. Do binders help? Okay, I know a toxin was the trigger. Anti-inflammatories, direct anti-inflammatories, something like ibuprofen or occasionally prednisone. That's not usually my go-to, or like the fish oils or some of those things. Does that help? Okay, if that doesn't help, sometimes the antihistamines are helpful. And I think this is a smaller subset of kids, and usually you can identify them. Their skin is usually a little more pale, a little more reactive, like you can write on the skin sometimes, or they tend to get kind of welty or they're rashy every time that they react to something. They'll have those allergic shiners, which is kind of that darkness, or just you can see it in your kid's eyes before they actually have the behaviors. They just don't look right. Sometimes they have the pink lips or kind of red around there. So these are your more histamine kids. Natural things. So quercetin is fantastic. Taking that before meals and at bedtime, very, very safe. If you do just a straight quercetin without bromelain, there's not much taste to that. Nettles is great. And a lot of times quercetin and nettles come together. So those are great for kind of just your classic allergies. Quercetin has an affinity for the kind of sinus area. So if there's a lot of congestion here, I really like that. But then we look at our, don't be afraid of something just because it's prescription or it's manufactured, so Claritin, especially, so Claritin and Zyrtec, both helpful, sometimes can make weird behaviors. So they don't entirely know how these things work, but our kids don't always metabolize them right. So you might find one and it makes your child aggressive. So try something different. It doesn't mean you can't do any other antihistamines. And sometimes I'll do Claritin in the morning and Zyrtec at night during a crisis. Like if I'm in the middle of treating parasites, which is notorious for triggering a lot of eosinophils and histamine, our way to get through that is probably going to be antihistamine. So Benadryl can be helpful. It makes you tired, so we're probably just doing that at night. Ketotifen we can have compounded for the gut, and that can be really great for the like colitis kids and the kids with a lot of, where we know like maybe they have crazy high eosinophils on a stool test, or they're reactive to every food. You just know your child can't eat anything. Ketotifen could be really helpful for you that way. So, high doses of vitamin C can also be helpful and helps you poop. So
do you use the Neuroprotect or some of the luteolin type products here as well?
I do. I have used those, and I don't often start with those. They get a little expensive, so I like to start with a single ingredient, see how we do. And then I might go to like a Orthomolecular makes a nice one called D-Hist. That's really good. They make a chewable. And then the Neuroprotect with the luteolin in there is really great for those really like brain inflamed sort of kids. So I usually reserve that when the other things make a little bit of a difference, but we're not really getting there and we want something to absorb a little bit better.
And what was there also a role here, baking soda? I've heard some people talk about.
Oh yeah. Of course. How did I not talk about it?
Yeah, I'm curious your thoughts on.
Yeah, so I've gotten really involved with the environmental medicine group and, in my training for LDA and some of those. And a lot of the allergists were saying, don't forget about baking soda or Trisalt or like Alka-Seltzer Gold. And I always thought of those things just as being alkalinizing, but they actually said if you take it, it stops the production of histamine and cytokines. So it can kind of prevent the start of that cascade. Where something like Benadryl is actually going to clean up histamine that's already there, this is actually going to stop it from starting. And I've seen that a lot of times when I'm doing LDA is I will just dose baking soda at the first start of a negative reaction if I seem to trigger someone. And often we can avoid doing prednisone, which has been nice.
I've seen a lot of these.
I'm going to just say, so doing the baking soda or the Trisalts, which taste a little bit better, doing a half a teaspoon to a teaspoon twice a day away from food, because I don't want to interfere with digestion. We need that acid for digestion, can be great. Like some of my very, very allergic kids have gotten off their antihistamines just doing the baking soda.
Yeah, that's fantastic and such an easy thing to do as well.
Yeah.
I know a lot of adults right now are finding relief from mast cell activation with DAO. Is that something that you found helpful in some of the kids or no?
Yeah, so it's helpful in some. I'm playing with that a little bit. Again, it gets a little more expensive. I haven't quite figured out the right dosing. So I'd be really open to hearing from you or from your viewers of what product they like, what kind of dosing, how are they doing it? Yeah, but it does work, especially when some of the others aren't quite working enough.
Yeah, and there used to be several really good products with DAO, and then my understanding is the supply got bought up by one company, and so now there's basically one product, and I think it's unfortunately not as strong as some of the others, so the cost is even higher than it used to be, is what I've been hearing. Another common issue that we see a lot in adults is SIBO, and we've talked about gut and microbial overgrowths in the gut in kids with autism. Is SIBO even something that happens in these kids as well, or no?
I mean, I think a lot of these kids have what really seems like SIBO. So classic SIBO, if you think of it, you wake up in the morning, you have a nice flat tummy, you feel pretty good. And as the day goes on and you eat anything, you start to get more and more bloated. The upper gut is feeling more tense. You might be burping. You may have this weird kind of acidic breath towards the end of the day, which you clearly can smell in your kids. So if you have this pattern, we're suspecting, small bowel overgrowth essentially. And so we have to address some of these bacteria. And if you do a stool test, a lot of times what I'm seeing is no growth of Acidophilus and bifidus, lots of growth of the non-pathogenic bacteria that in and of themselves aren't a big deal. But when you have 10 different ones thriving, it's completely killing off your good flora, regardless of how many probiotics you're taking. And so it impacts motility. So a lot of times we'll see constipation happening with that and some of those things too. So, SIBO is a tricky one to treat. But ultimately we just have to get the balance back, and there was a great presentation at Autism One last year that should still be available online about some of the approaches to that and kind of the categories, and really having to address that with diet as well.
Fantastic. So let's talk a little bit about microbiome. How do you improve the microbiome and shift it towards a healthier microbiome?
That's the $1 million question. If I could figure that out, I would be able to retire, So, I think a lot of times we do have to do some killing just to kind of even the playing field. And then it's about repopulating with a diversity of probiotics. So I think it goes beyond Acidophilus and Bifidus. Sometimes that can be great. Like I've had good luck with VSL3 in particular, and some of the Claire probiotics I really like. I'm excited about the Megaspore biotic. It's hard to get consistently, so don't run out and start it right now because we're all in a shortage and we're trying to stay on that. But that's some of the spore-based bacteria, and some of the thought is it's actually directing the gut microbiome. Products like Restore can be good, or things with glutamine and things with Sliprium and things to kind of heal that gut barrier can be important. Sometimes things like naltrexone can be really good to help with the immune response that's going there. And it also helps with gut motility. So the low doses of naltrexone can be helpful for that. I find that our body gets used to probiotics as well as it gets used to antimicrobials. So I like to rotate things probably monthly just to keep the bugs guessing and try and help with the diversity. I think fecal transplants are something to do in these very stubborn cases. And, there are products available where you can actually get the capsules of the product that come to you frozen. I think that that's a possibility if you don't have a good source near you. I think that custom stool LDI is an approach as well for the immune piece, but I still feel like we have to do some killing first.
Yeah, I saw a very creative marketing company. I think they were in Canada in that realm that you were talking about with the capsules, and I think it was called Repopulate.
Repopulate, perfect. I love that.
So
sounds like a name that you'd make up in the middle of the night while you're drinking a beer, right?
Yeah, and I kind of wonder too, you mentioned the autologous stool-based LDI. I wonder, as the immune system starts to become a little more tolerant, if it would be interesting to do some study and see if that also then had some positive effect on shifting the microbiome by changing the immune response to the bugs that are there.
All I know is, I start everything with my adults before I do it with my kids. And I've gotten a lot of feedback of with some of my Lyme patients where we were blaming Bartonella on some of the gut issues or some of these things, or we had diagnosed SIBO and we're not having a response to the antibiotics or to the natural things, that the custom stool, even as a sublingual LDI, has been really effective to really flatten that tummy out, help with the pain. It's been amazing. So
yeah, that's great. So when a child has a Herxheimer reaction, it's maybe a little bit more difficult to kind of differentiate them in kids, but what kinds of things can you do to pull them out of it? And I'm guessing one of them is probably also the baking soda, right? Because then that's
baking soda for sure. I would say my top ones would be baking soda and charcoal, to see if that helps. And then usually at that point, before I've gotten into aggressive killing, I've probably tried to figure out, what's calming to their system anyways. But you think any of the binders that we talked about, you think antihistamines can be good, and you think your anti-inflammatories, your fish oil, your curcumins, your neuroprotects, those sorts of things. And so I like to, before I get into an aggressive, like if I'm going to go after Lyme or I'm doing something else, I want to figure out what's already helped to calm this child down so that I already have the tools on hand to know, all right, if things flare, if we see naughty behaviors that have come or behaviors you haven't seen in a couple of years, or all of a sudden your child's not behaving like themselves, that can be a Herx.
Yeah, and I think that's really smart for everyone to know ahead of time if they have some reaction that's a Herxheimer type response. What is it that they should be doing, and not then have to wait for their medical team to be able to get back to them. So I think it's a good proactive discussion as what are some of these tools like you just talked about that I can do if there is some kind of reaction. I see all too often people have these reactions and they don't know what they should do, and then they have trouble getting in contact with their doctor while they're really sick and whatnot. So I think that's really, really smart.
But also, so there's some simple things. I'm sorry, I'm not trying to cut you off. So there's some simple things, like if you don't know that. So, milk thistle is always good to support the liver, because a lot of times these drugs were metabolized, or things that backed up. So milk thistle's easy. Nutrimetics berber. Beyond Balance, the Toxis GL, really great. It's a liquid, or even just the Toxis capsules, that can be good. if you haven't pooped, give yourself an enema or go get a colonic. Oh my gosh, that's coffee enema would be amazing. Castor oil pack over the liver and the abdomen. These are things that are going to help you feel better.
Yeah, and I'm a big advocate for coffee enemas. I mean, they saved me
Me
for
too.
many years with inflammation and pain. I know it's harder to do in kids, but adults, absolutely, I think that should be considered and explored. Let's talk a little bit about genetics. And so, we know that genes themselves don't change all that often, and yet people are very focused on MTHFR and CBS and COMT and all these other things, and they really start to kind of identify with it. And I know methylation is important, but is it really that we have bad genes, or is it that these things are now being triggered towards dis-ease because of the environmental toxicity and more epigenetic things?
So my background was as a biochemist. So the more they started to learn about genetics, I completely geeked out on that, right? I have every methylation pathway blown up all over my wall, and I had everyone do their genetics, and I mapped the whole thing out. And really, what it comes down to, I do think that that's important, but not as important as I once thought it was. It's how are the genes being phenotypically expressed? So how is the environment playing out, and how are these things actually presenting themselves? Because it's just because you find out, oh, you're COMT++ and CBS++, oh my gosh, I'm doomed. No, you're not doomed. A lot of us are running around, okay, I'm MTHFR++, I'm very functional, I exercise 1 million hours a day, I feel great, right? Because I've figured out how to get around that. And it was interesting, Dr. Neubrander did a study recently with some of his patients where he had looked at the genetics and was looking at methylation panels and finding that it really didn't make a difference in the end. If you stuck it out a few years with B12 shots and some of the other things he's doing, the outcomes were the same as far as methylation cycles repairing themselves. So pretty interesting data that he's about to present there. And, I think at this point, I look at genetics more if I'm feeling really stuck. If I'm working with a child, and I find the organic acid test is really helpful of how are these things actually playing out. So we've got some vulnerabilities, but how is it presenting right now? What are those neurotransmitters looking like? What is glutathione pathways looking like? How, what are these things actually, how is it presenting? How is all my B vitamins? Let's run a methylation panel and actually see, because are you eating an organic diet? Have you been getting a lot of folates in the diet? Have you already been doing supplementation or not? And so it's not the kiss of death, but I do like to look at that if I'm really feeling stuck of how come I can't get this child to respond? Then sometimes we'll find, oh, there's a weird IgA issue, or maybe there's a weird histamine thing that we didn't think of, and they just don't present like a histamine child. And so I found that to be helpful. Or we'll find, whoa, there's all kinds of stuff with all their folate receptors. Okay, I'm going to have to go crazy high doses with folate with this kid when I didn't think of that before. So that I usually use it now, not as a first step, but a later step.
So I know there's some genes that are potentially not as easily changeable that define certain physical characteristics and things like that. But is it reasonable to think that if the gene is expressing a certain way, that doing things like supporting detoxification and reducing heavy metals and reducing pesticides and improving our nutritional content and those types of things can then cause that gene to express in a way that is more supportive of our health?
Well, I think you can look at, Ben Lynch has really made a really nice new pathway planner where it shows a lot of the nutrients that each gene are dependent on. And I often start there. Let's look for deficiencies and let's look at some of the things that slow that particular gene down. And so if I look and go, okay, this child is really low in folate. Well, what do I need to support the genes to help me process that better? What are the nutrients that are probably missing from the diet, or what are some exposures that are happening that are slowing that down? And that's really where my focus has been, is how can we support this? Because even a compromised gene, even a plus MTHFR still has some function. It's just maybe you need a little more oomph to get that working to the level that we need to keep up with our environment.
So there's things we can do. What I want to get across is that people should still feel empowered even when they get these genetic results and not feel despair or discouraged because, to your point, I have some of the worst genes as well, and I've done really, really well over the years. And so I think doing those things that are good for us, we can at least influence the expression of the genes while we're also doing some of the things that you're talking about by bringing in the nutritional support and things of that nature.
Right. And that's where it's helpful. If you run a 23andMe and or you've done your HLA-DR and some of these things and we know where they are, then let's go, okay, well, what do I know about this gene? What impacts this gene? What slows it down? What is it involved with? What's the key? What am I maybe not? Maybe I'm not going to make glutathione right because I have problems with my, GSTT1 or something like that, so we can know then maybe where to put a little more focus on. But it doesn't mean that you're doomed to always be unhealthy. It just means that's maybe where the snafu is and why you got unhealthy in the first place. So let's do some extra focus support there.
Yeah, I think that's totally right. And I think that, when people say, well, why did one person get exposed to a tick and got Lyme disease and another got exposed to the same tick and the same microbes and they're completely fine? I think a lot of it does come back to our ability to detoxify. I think that's such a key part. So what are some of the therapies that your patients love or respond most commonly? If people come in and, the few things that they say, wow, that really, really worked, what stands out in your mind?
Oh my gosh, I wrote this down. Okay. I wrote it down because I was like, well, this is a big question. In the moment, I'm not going to think of it. So B12 shots for sure. Even from when I first started, I think B12 shots when we're dealing with autism or even with my chronically ill adults, I think have been a wow. Low-dose naltrexone, definitely one of my favorites. Treating parasites, really important, especially when there's funny like neurotransmitter, mood, aggression, allergy sort of stuff. That treating the parasites has been big. Treating yeast, huge gains with getting on top of the yeast. And then chelation, of course, it's a good antioxidant, but it also brings the overall load down. And we're seeing some really nice gains in cognitive function and just overall presence. Anti-inflammatories are good temporarily to put out the fire, but I think the other ones have the longer lasting results of really getting recovery.
So around detoxification, one of the things people talk about is keeping the lymphatic fluids moving. Not everyone can access a manual lymphatic drainage type person. So are there some at-home tools people can do to really help support the movement of the lymph fluid?
Absolutely. So, the little handheld facial cleansers, like the little devices. So there's one called a Solo Mio, M-I-O, which you can just get on Amazon. So it's battery operated. You can use it in the shower. So the lymph is a very surfacey sort of light thing. So this is not a firm pressure. This is a light thing, just like if you're using a Clarisonic, which would work well, it'd be the expensive way of doing it. But if you're cleaning your face, same thing. You can just follow the lymph patterns. You can look up on Google. Basically, lymph is going to flow from out to in. So the direction is always this way or from the legs up or from the neck down. It kind of goes here to the clavicle and then down to the liver. I think getting a little mini trampoline, like a rebounder, can be really good. So that bouncing motion can be good. I think doing Qigong can be good. You can get the dry skin brush and just using the dry skin brush, same sort of direction. That works really well. But the little Solo Mios, those work great. If your kids don't mind the vibration, it works really good. It actually feels really good.
I agree. I have one based on your past recommendations, and I think it's been really, really helpful.
But there's also some topical like lymph, Viotrex makes a lymph spray that can be really nice. Grapefruit essential oil topical can be really nice. I think castor oil packs over the liver because the lymph flows into the liver. So that can actually really help with the lymph movement as well. It's a simple thing.
And I've even just taken like the liquid or the cream Iteries from Pecana as well. The liquid sometimes, and right? Just put that on as well. So one of the hot topics in autism has been the role of vaccinations. And so I'm curious, what's your perspective as a clinician? What role do vaccines play in the initiation of autism in some children? Is it a big role? Not a big role? What are your thoughts?
So I have kids in my practice who have been vaccinated and who've not been vaccinated. So I don't think it's the only piece, but I do think it is for many kids, it's the tipping point. They had a vulnerable system and it tipped them over the edge. What we know about vaccines in general is it suppresses mitochondria for at least a few days. It stops oxygen flow to the brain for at least several hours, if not longer. If you're giving Tylenol, that shuts down glutathione production for a few days. So it can be sort of that. For a child that was already compromised, it can be that sort of kiss of death because you do it all at once. And then if you combine it with like a live viral vaccine, something like the MMR, which I've got to say in my experience, and I'm not saying that you should never vaccinate or anything like that, but I have enough kids in my practice where they were developing normally. They had their round of vaccines. Either they were sick at the time or they had a bunch of vaccines at once. There was something else going on. They already had a lot of diarrhea or food allergies. There were already signs when we look back in hindsight. but they have that and they've never been the same since. Either seizures, head banging, that loss of eye contact, they just haven't been the same. And, like with the MMR, a lot of times we're needing to do these antivirals or these high doses of vitamin A to try and actually knock that viral load back down and then do some healing. A lot of the vaccines also have, either they have heavy metals, so they have the thimerosal, they have aluminum. You put the two together, it like amplifies the effect of that. And so you get these very kind of brain soluble forms of these heavy metals. And again, you put it all together and it can just be the tipping point for your child that was already compromised.
Yeah, and I've even in adults with Lyme, I certainly have talked to several that were doing really well and then got a vaccine as an adult for something. And then that was the thing that also really made their Lyme much more significantly challenging. So It's certainly something to be educated about and to speak with everyone's doctors and decide what the best path forward is. What are some of the most important things that you do for your own health on a regular basis?
For me, so going off gluten was huge, hard. I tried to convince myself for many years that I was fine with it, but going off that, I have Hashimoto's, so I have an autoimmune condition, and consistently going off gluten, one of the best things I could have done. Not only do you lose that inflammatory kind of 10 pounds of weight almost instantly, but my joints felt better, everything else. And then exercise. Honestly, the more I exercise, the better I feel. So I exercise at least an hour plus a day, and that keeps me going. And getting good sleep, I think, is also essential. So, and going on vacation.
And, I think the fact that you're living your purpose and your passion certainly doesn't help, because I know how much you are passionate about the work that you do. And I think that really feeds us as well. So
for sure.
It's amazing. So where can people find you? Are you taking new patients at this point? How do they reach out to your office if they're interested in learning more?
Yeah, I am taking new patients at this point. I have a good team of doctors that works with me. And so I feel like a good support system now around me. I wasn't able to take new patients for a long time. So if someone wants to go to holistichealingarts.org, which is my website, you can just download. We've made it really simple to become a new patient. There's just a little one-page thing that you'll fill out and send back to us. And every week, myself and the doctors at my clinic will look through that, see which doctor would be the best fit. If you're requesting myself or someone in particular, you can do that. But then we'll brainstorm on that and then get you started. So make that pretty easy.
Fantastic. That's great. You have been an incredible mentor of mine over the past almost 12 years, which is hard to imagine. In fact, you were the first person that I ever personally had autonomic response testing done with. And so you've been a huge part of my journey. I appreciate all that you do, all that you've done for me, and all that you do for others as well. You are certainly an amazing practitioner, an amazing person, and you're making a big, big difference in the world. So I thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to be here today. It's been really informative, and I appreciate you.
And thank you for doing what you do. I mean, you've educated so many of us doctors, and I think you are such a great catalyst of taking all this great information and presenting it to other people. Without people like you, all of this would just be stuck in somebody's office somewhere. So thank you for doing what you do.
Thanks, Dr. Derksen. Have a great rest of your day.
Hey, you too.
For more information on today's guest, visit holistichealingarts.org. That's holistichealingarts.org. I appreciate your support of the Better Health Guy blogcasts series. If you'd like to follow me, you can find me on Facebook and Twitter as Better Health Guy. The show can be found on YouTube, iTunes, Google Play, and Stitcher. If you'd like to support the show, please visit betterhealthguy.com/donate. And if you'd like to be added to my newsletter, please visit betterhealthguy.com/newsletters. I'm looking forward to many more shows ahead and appreciate your interest.
Thanks for listening to this Better Health Guy blogcast with Scott, your Better Health Guy. To check out additional shows and learn more about Scott's personal journey to better health, please visit betterhealthguy.com.